Hello and welcome to this special live recording of Inside Briefing, the podcast from the Institute for Government. I'm Gemma Tetlow, Chief Economist at the Institute for Government. Just a few hours ago, Jeremy Hunt set out his budget in Parliament. We've crunched the numbers, looked at the charts, weighed up the forecasts and made sense, or tried to at least, of what we heard from the Chancellor. So what did the Chancellor announce in his budget and what does it tell us about the economy, the government spending plans and how the next year might play out? Joining me to answer these questions are more of my IFG colleagues, Senior Economist Olly Bartrum and Senior Fellows Giles, Wilkes and Jill Rutter. Hello all.
Good afternoon.
Hi.
Olly, let me start with you. What was your take on the budget?
So I think the Chancellor was in a relatively difficult position. He's obviously determined to deliver tax cuts with the election coming up, but there was basically no change in the economic and fiscal forecast from the OBR. He would have been hoping for a little bit more headroom than he eventually got. So faced with that difficult position, he still did deliver a quite large personal tax cut in the form of cutting national insurance, but he had to do quite a lot of targeted tax rises in order to pay for that. So whether that's the extension of the energy windfall tax, the vaping tax, there's more that I've forgotten. Non-doms, there we go. That's the big one. So I think that was sort of the broad changes we saw in terms of policy and the background situation that he was facing. I think sort of big picture, I was struck by Hunt's sort of continued insistence that he could do three things at the same time, which are to cut taxes, meet his fiscal rules and improve public services. This sort of reveals quite a bit of delusion, I guess, in this fiscal fiction that we and others have been talking about quite a lot in the run-up to the budget, and we'll get into detail a bit more later. But ultimately, he didn't really confront some of the really big fiscal and public services challenges that we face. The can has been kicked down the road, and problem has been maybe made a bit worse for the next government who will have to deal with this.
Yeah, I definitely want to come back to that, the bad behaviours that we talked about in advance and how those played out this time. But Jill, coming to you first, how do you think Hunt balanced the sort of political pressure he was under with the economic reality, as Olly said, that actually there really wasn't a lot of new good news for him to play with?
Well, it's quite interesting because he clearly was under quite a lot of pressure from some people to create more headroom by penciling in even less realistic spending numbers for post-budget. And he seems to have resisted that. And indeed, he found a bit of extra money for the NHS, which he claims is going to boost productivity. So it'll be very interesting to see that with £2.5 billion here and then some money for NHS capital, which I'm sure Olly will explain where that's come from. And it's quite interesting because he did decide to go for the strategy of a pick and mix set of tax rises. That's always where you're looking for, can he actually get away with them? And then spending money on actually stuff, most of which had been very extensively pre-briefed. I mean, surprised from absolutely nobody that he didn't really reinstate the 5p fuel duty tax cut that Rishi Sunak introduced as Chancellor in a very early response to the cost of living crisis, didn't index fuel duty, despite that being in the numbers, so that counts as a tax cut. And then the pre-briefed stealing non-doms. Maybe it's just because he listened to George Osborne and Ed Balls' podcast last week who were telling him to do it, but did open up a flank of potential attack from Labour, while also taking away a bit of their thunder and a bit of their room for manoeuvre if they do form the government after the election. I mean, the bit that hadn't been trailed as widely, that was seeping out, was the move on the child benefit charge, which obviously helps people in that sort of unusual situation. There's sort of, the people who earn 50, 60,000, or those couples not the couples, the single earners who've been very frustrated by that, and potentially foreshadowing what may be a bit of an administrative nightmare for his successor in terms of trying to reverse a bit of independent taxation to allow an assessment on a household basis. So, can he persuade them national insurance and things? I thought the really interesting thing in all of it was Jeremy Hunt has clearly persuaded himself, if not yet the rest of his party, that national insurance is a much worse tax than income tax. And I think given all that debate beforehand about would it be income tax, how much more politically potent cutting income tax is than national insurance, it's really interesting that not just did he go back to national insurance now and take another 2 pence off that, but he made very clear that for as long as he remains Chancellor, and maybe we see this in the Conservative manifesto, the target for tax cutting is not going to be income tax, it's going to be national insurance. And I thought that was probably the most interesting thing to emerge from the whole budget speech, because that I didn't expect.
No, I mean, that was a really interesting way for him to end the speech by saying that his long-term ambition was to end this unfairness of double taxation of earnings, by which I think he means he's talking about income tax and NICs being paid on earnings, which seemed like a pretty major tax strategy announcement to be sort of...
And we discovered that for some reason you're not on the same Conservative Party copy list that I am, because, you know, winging into my inbox very shortly after Jeremy Hunt sat down was an email from Jeremy Hunt, or Conservative Central Office, I think as it's more likely to be, telling me that he was going to end the unfairness of double taxation. I mean, you know, and that's really interesting. Does he want to merge income tax and national insurance contributions? Does he want to eliminate employee national insurance contributions? That's actually really interesting, because whenever chancellors have needed money, and we saw Rishi Sunak do just that, whenever they've needed to raise money, they've tended to think national insurance are an easier tax to raise than income tax, less politically salient, and still maintaining the fiction that for some reason it's linked to the NHS or to pensions and things like that. So I think it's a really interesting new political direction, but it may be that I'm reading far too much into it.
The health and social care levy feels like decades ago now, really, doesn't it?
It does. How long ago was it? When was it actually reversed? I think in 2022. I mean, it sort of squeaked under the wire because the bill had just gone through the Commons when Jeremy Hunt became Chancellor and reversed all those Liz Truss quasi-Kwarteng tax cuts. So it's part of the Liz Truss legacy that lives on.
I mean, we should say that I think a lot of tax nerds out there, us, people like the IFS, would be quite pleased with this direction of travel, that it's reducing the wedge between taxation of different forms of income. But it is an argument that a lot of external tax experts have been making for many, many years, that we hasn't landed at all with previous chancellors, and suddenly we seem to have one.
It would be quite interesting to have it as a sort of declared tax strategy and a sort of clear public explanation of why you want to go in this sense of direction. But I think it's really interesting because you have this sort of view from quite a lot of people around that, they probably shouldn't have been thinking about cutting tax at all. Mm-hmm. But if you were to cut direct taxes, this was the right way to go. And this was actually quite sensible, though I think some new pressure group called Silver Voices were already pointing out that this is a tax cut from which pensioners, even working pensioners, don't benefit. So that may emerge on the Conservative backbenches in coming days and weeks.
Yeah. What did you make of this, Giles?
Well, I mean, it's funny because we're all engrossed in it. So when you spend an hour just listening to the Chancellor really measure after measure and trying to make a note of it, you think, wow, there's an awful lot here. And then you step back. And my reaction then was, it was a bit of a Nothingburger because, firstly, everything was briefed before. There was virtually nothing in there that you couldn't have already guessed. That's number one. Number two, the amount of time he dwelt on things that are really very boring. I mean, I know that it matters a lot to the people who have child benefit withdrawn because they happen to be on this income rather than that income. But to go on at such length about that sort of thing is pretty dull. And also, as Olly pointed out earlier, if your hobby is afterwards getting the OBR figures and then comparing what they were before to afterwards, there was virtually no change in the economic forecast for the first time in quite a while, which meant, a little bit up here, a little bit down there. So it meant, in a sense, the Labour Party was able to prepare its response pretty easily, knowing it didn't have much of a moving target. And I think, fourthly, when the biggest thing in it, in the sense of like commentators talking about the tactics and everything, was, oh, look, he stole some Labour ideas. The keeping the energy windfall tax, going after this non-dawn things. In other words, turning the focus on Labour. That's a pretty dim outlook. So I had to struggle to find really interesting stuff. And I think insofar as there was some, I didn't really cotton on to the national insurance thing because it seems so implausible they could actually get rid of it. I thought it was interesting that he tried to really take on the argument that it's irresponsible to keep these public spending totals. And let's face it, the IFG is really in this argument. We point out that the state of public services is very, very poor and they need more money. And the people further to the right, the Trust Brigade, say, no, nonsense, look at public sector productivity, you could do something about that. And Hunt took on that argument and said, look, I'm investing this money in NHS capital, I'm doing this or that to try to make it much more productive, which obviously makes you ask, why did you not do this 10 years ago when you were in charge of that department? But he kind of started taking on that argument. There was an argument won in Downing Street between the people who have said, be much more irresponsible. We're facing a total wipeout at the next election. You cannot be the Chancellor who failed to throw everything at it. And he won that argument that said, no, being sensible is better. So he didn't cut future spending totals, which is where we've been complaining tirelessly that it's a kind of a free pot of unrealistic money that the chancellors are dipping into all the time and trying to use to fund current spending. So he won that argument, and he tried to take on the argument that you can still run things on a tight ship. So, that is of some interest if it wasn't for the fact that almost regardless of what happens at the next election, and please let it be soon, he's not likely to be the chancellor for very much longer. So I think that's ultimately as well, it's the last budget of a chancellor who probably knows it's his last significant budget. And so he expressed his brand ultimately, which is quite technocratic and careful. He didn't want to blow the doors off or please the people further on his right. So that's what I've taken from it. But I don't really see, obviously it won't change the political atmosphere much. It might just about set up an argument between the Conservatives and Labour about public spending versus tax cuts. But they're really against the public there.
And as you say, two of the major tax rises that were in this, the non-dom change and the extending the energy windfall tax, were things that the Labour Party have talked about doing. And this is sort of billed as creating a trap for them, taking away. Does it really work? Because, mere months ago, the Treasury was leaking out saying the non-dom policy was crazy, it was going to be damaging to the UK economy.
But suddenly they've discovered it raises quite a lot of money, which, as Olly and I were discussing earlier, leaked Treasury analysis last year said doesn't really raise anything, it deters more people coming from here. And the policy costings, obviously, with a big behavioural caveat on it, actually have it raising quite substantial. And that opened them up to an attack from Keir Starmer, who said, well, now you've admitted it raised lots of money, you can't make the objection in principle anymore to this. So actually just think about all the things you've missed out being able to spend money on, reeled off a list of things you could have bought with the non-dom tax change. Obviously one of the big advantages for the leader of the opposition doing that really impossible job of responding to the budget has helped enormously if almost every measure has appeared and been well canvassed in the press beforehand. So I do think, while that has obviously made it more difficult for Labour to pay for some of the things they wanted to do on the basis of Rachel Reeves insisting everything has to be covered by some revenue raising or other saving, it does seem to me to have opened up the Conservatives an argument about why have you resisted this for so long, potentially particularly exposing the Prime Minister on that.
The thing is that I think power over the baseline does have a pretty enormous effect, because if we look at what's happened over the past couple of fiscal events, the Conservatives have announced tax cuts, personal tax cuts that amount to £20 billion per year, plus additional business tax cuts that take it to then £30 billion a year. And then you square that with how Labour's changed its policies over that same period. They've dropped a £30 billion investment pledge as a result of the changing baseline and fiscal position, even though they hadn't signed up to those tax cuts before they happened, but they kind of feel as though they're in a position where they then can't promise to reverse them. So, I do think doing this does put Labour in quite a difficult position, particularly given how close fiscal policy now is to the wire in terms of breaking fiscal rules.
Yeah. Giles, on this point about them having leaked all of the major policies, as Jill said, with possible exception of what they did on the high income child benefit charge, you've worked as a special advisor. Do you understand what's the strategy in having
No,
done
I
that?
think, I was very much a policy advisor. I used to look with sort of a mixture of contempt and fear on the comms people who'd spent their whole time enjoying having battles with the journalists about having their particular pitch rolled in the particular way. And I thought it ended up being a wash. I'm quite sort of proper about this and think, can't we just keep it to ourselves? So I don't really see, I don't think the logic was particularly good in this case, because surely the point is, the person with the most difficult job on this day is Keir Starmer. He's not normally doing the finance job, but it's tradition that says the leader of the opposition has to face the chancellor. The chancellor's been preparing it for 3 months. The leader of the opposition has to guess. So the more you can surprise him, the better. So I would have thought it made more sense to keep absolutely stum and then come out with stuff. But instead, they gave him a chance to absolutely prepare and sort of give a fairly sort of decent attacking reply. So I don't really see the point of it at all. And I think it's more of a sign of the discipline of the government breaking down, that they want to stay on side with journalists who will soon be ignoring them very hard. And so they want to sort of carry on giving them goodies, and this is what happens.
I also wondered whether Jeremy Hunt, we've been big advocates for a single fiscal event. I think it's really interesting, given, as Olly said, the forecast didn't really change very much, so that sort of limited the Chancellor's room for manoeuvre. Whether actually in his heart of hearts he might think, actually, if I hadn't done quite a lot in November, because he kept on having to hark back to the measures, remember I did full expensing, remember I did this already, things. He actually could have done something that might have made a bit more of the political weather now, because lots of people were saying, well, you did all that stuff in November and it didn't really move the dial at all. Is it going to this time? And I think it's really interesting, because we've heard all the sort of political chancellors arguing you need lots of fiscal events, give yourself lots of bites in the cherry, lots of times to make announcements. I know way back, the huge frustrations of people who saw them as more political, that the Treasury didn't have enough Treasury moments. But I think actually Jeremy Hunt might have been better served by just having sort of one quite big event rather than two slightly more, as Giles technically put it, Nothingburger-y events.
Well, yeah, and also I think, to be fair, together, if you look at everything he's done since March last year, there's quite a good supply-side package there. Now, supply-side economics never wins elections. Let's not stop setting that as the target, because that's much bigger forces, and voter indifference is almost impossible to move. But he's announced an incredible big business tax cut that's now becoming full and permanent. Insofar as he's cut taxes on work, it's increased the total amount in the labour force by 200,000, which is the problem for the labour force right now. He's continued to fund some fairly decent below-the-radar industrial strategies that, nobody's particularly excited by it. You have to Google really hard to look them up. But we would have been absolutely delighted with them 10 years ago, let alone the last Labour government, which didn't have anything like this much money for its industrial strategy. So perhaps, as Jill says, if it was all agglomerated into one big moment and looked like one big strategy, but instead we have this silly tactical ComSpad-led sort of arena. What's he going to do this time? And can he wrong-foot people? And can he shoot Labour foxes? I think if maybe they'd accepted that you really can't move the voters and we might as well do the right thing, he would have had one great big fantastic fiscal moment last autumn, and he'd go down pretty well. As it is, we're judging him tactically.
I do worry that if the sort of economic outlook improves over the next few months, they'll go for one more before the election. Obviously it depends when we think it will be, but I think if there are clear improvements, so if interest rate outlook turns out to be better than expected, or some other big determinant of the fiscal forecast moves, then I don't see why they wouldn't, for political reasons, give in to the temptation to have our first summer statement, maybe, or something like that. Obviously, we think it would be terrible for fiscal policy making, but
picking up on that point about terrible practices in fiscal policy making, Olly, we put out a report just before the budget setting out some of the ways in which we think there have been problems with fiscal policy making, some weaknesses in the fiscal framework and the fiscal rules. Can you run us through the problems that we've seen in the past, and do you think we saw a repeat of those bad behaviours this time?
Sure. So we identified 6 problems. I think we probably saw some form of 5 of those. So I think the big one is fiscal fiction, which is what we spoke about earlier, where governments pencil in implausible spending plans beyond the end of the current spending review period. Now, by implausible, we don't mean public spending cannot go down. We just mean that based on the government's ambitions to improve public services, not reduce the quantity of them in any way, and actually increase spending in a number of areas like NHS, defence and development, the penciled-in totals just aren't consistent with that.
Yeah, and Jeremy Hunt, I lost track of how many times he said better public services in
his
speech.
Exactly. Now, as Jill said at the start, he didn't actually make that worse. There was some speculation that he could even further reduce those penciled-in spending totals. He just held them flat where they are, but continued to not spell out how they will be achieved. So that's one. Another problem we identified is fiscal fine-tuning, which is sort of frequently and abruptly changing fiscal policy in responses to changes in headroom. I think just holding a budget and announcing some policy means that he did fiscal fine-tuning.
And actually, there wasn't really any change in the headroom, but we saw a lot of measures raising some money on one hand to do some of the giveaways on the other.
Yes, exactly. All those different sort of narrow tax rises that we saw in order to pay for the broad-based cut. We identified gaming as another issue. Now, it's hard to say with only a couple of hours since the speech whether a lot of what we saw was gaming, but I think a lot of the timing of the policies seems to be very convenient for meeting fiscal rules, even though it's not necessarily, good for fiscal sustainability. So that NHS capital spending that Jill spoke about earlier, there's about £1 billion in every year, from the next year on, other than in the final year of the forecast where there's zero, which is the point at which it would have made a difference to the fiscal rule. So that timing seems quite convenient. The introduction of the non-dom change comes in right at the end of the forecast, just in time to make a difference to performance against the fiscal rule. And the extension to the windfall tax, basically what that does fiscally is just top up the final year a little bit with a bit more tax, and then expires once the forecast period is over, and it doesn't therefore matter for the fiscal rule. So there appears to have been some gaming. Now, it might be for very sensible policy reasons that I haven't identified, but the stars seem to have aligned in quite a good way. Another thing we identified was short-termism. I think we just saw a bit of a continuation of that with sort of front-loaded giveaways. Another one is arbitrary policy choices. So this is that sort of when the government initially announced capital expensing but made it temporary rather than permanent. We described that as quite arbitrary. We saw, I guess, another mini version of that today when Jeremy Hunt promised to extend that policy to leased assets, but only when affordable. Yep, so it's sort of a half promise that's not then in the numbers. So yeah, 5 out of 6 today. The one he didn't do was inappropriate macroeconomic stance. I mean, you could argue that one, but we won't.
Great. Okay. So unfortunately, we haven't seen a massive turnaround. Let's hope that the next fiscal event, whenever that is, shows some better practices. I guess one thing that we highlighted in our paper was the extent to which the OBR could make some of these bad behaviours more apparent, or try and ways that we might raise the political cost of behaving in these ways. Do you think did we see that? How much did they do that today?
So the OBR, I think, continues to do a good job in its sort of broader commentary. So they, in their press conference earlier, and sort of in a box buried deep in here, they do call out the implausibility of the spending plans. But in their formal assessment of government's performance against fiscal rules, they still have to give the government a pass, even when it seems, at least to us, very unlikely that they're on track. So, I mean, we didn't necessarily see the OBR do more than it usually does, but it's sort of continued to call this out as a big risk and not really good for
they do have quite a useful list of what they call policy risks, which are some of the things which the government knows it's going to have to pay but hasn't quite crystallised yet. So, we were looking for the infected blood compensation payments, the horizon compensation payments, where the government's made not quite enough of a commitment yet for the OBR to score them. And they do, of course, point out, as always, the fact that they're still assuming that some chancellor sometime raises fuel duty, and that's in the numbers, even though the revealed preference of governments is not to do that. So,
Jill, one of the other areas that we've done work in the past and critiqued policy-making processes is just generally around how the tax policy-making process works. What do you think we saw with these budget measures? Were they well developed? What could have been done better?
Were they well developed? Well, we don't know that much about what the internal processes behind them were and how far these have been subject to clear strategic thought about what we want to do, where we're trying to go overall, the shape of the income tax system, how they interact with sets of other measures, what other measures they're supporting, what other government policies they're supporting. So it's quite difficult to judge, but some of them are quite surprising. Some of them take quite some time to come in. So if you're looking at something, we've got interim measures, there's interim hike in the thresholds for the child benefit charge, but then a move, which may be quite administratively complicated, to try and reverse that bit of independent taxation, so you can do joint household assessment of eligibility. So I don't think these again, particularly convinced that there was a very clear long-run strategic direction. As I said, it would be really interesting to have a sort of government view on the appropriate long-run direction for the taxation of income, which we haven't had, because we've had, when I first joined the Treasury, unearned income was taxed massively more than earned income. We then had this switch through George Osborne introducing lots of specific allowances for unearned income, for savings income and dividends and stuff like that. We switched back, and now we seem to be switching and really, really prioritising. I think it's quite interesting that the extent to which labour market participation emerges as a really big theme, and the Chancellor really liking it when he can score that there is a positive labour market effect from some of the measures, and that I think is something that's only really emerged post-pandemic as a really big issue. And of course the OBR also wrote up the numbers for immigration as well, so it's not just UK domestic labour market participation they're hoping to go up. They've also predicated on a higher net inward
they've just taken
they're
a
much lower, much lower than current levels.
But I think that is an area where the OBR, the way it approaches its forecast, has shifted, that they are doing more of the sort of factoring in the supply side improvements of policy measures, which we didn't see much of in
Yes, I can't remember them, for example, under the coalition, improving the labour supply measures on the back of us raising the income tax threshold and lowering everybody's effective tax take.
And it certainly wasn't explicitly spelled out in the way that we
wasn't.
know.
I mean, we saw really rapidly rising employment, and maybe that was part of the story. And the OBR was frequently having to adjust downwards productivity because upwards employment, but it didn't seem to anticipate it as a result. And so maybe that is a new thing. But yeah, I think Jeremy Hunt has won off the OBR higher scores for his sort of supply side measures than probably any previous chancellor who's worked with the OBR.
And maybe that's partly, she said, I don't know quite the timing on this, partly a response to the critique that the OBR had a very static approach to costing benefits, and a bit of the Liz Truss critique.
I think it'd be
maybe that's
very
where they
unfair.
make it more explicit.
Yeah, I think they've certainly been more transparent about this since the autumn of 2022 when they started to come into the spotlight about exactly how they dealt with this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that they've just increasingly focused on over the years as well. I mean, there were some examples in the early 2010s, like the national minimum living wage and things like that, but it's become more routine. I guess particularly they developed an interest in looking at the supply side around Brexit. And then you see it sort of continuing to evolve from there, and I think they've recruited quite a few people to specifically work on this in the past year or two, whereas it used to be sort of one or two people with the whole supply side of the economy in a spreadsheet.
But they didn't ignore it. I mean, the one I'm thinking of is the super deduction, which came before full expensing. They did evaluate it. It's just because it was temporary, it just moved investment forward a little bit, made a sort of an ugly looking chart, but didn't really change the long-term productivity of the economy. But it's not like they were not interested. It's just, so maybe what's happened is the government has realised that it has to do better if it wants to get a decent score out of the OBR.
Yeah, and I guess from the OBR's perspective, it might not have done these things in the past because they don't necessarily move the economy forecast a great deal. They don't really move the economy forecast more than a very small forecast error, for example. But by doing stuff like this, they provide politicians with the incentives to develop these schemes a bit more, which I think is probably the most important function that they serve.
Yeah. So Jill and Giles, we talked a bit already about Keir Starmer's response, but overall, how do you think Labour responded to this?
Well, I mean, everyone's right. I mean, that this has put them in a difficult position because, I mean, effectively, I mean, the nightmare for this government is not just losing the election heavily, which looks quite likely right now. It's losing the election and handing over a really healthy fiscal situation to the Labour Party, which would then almost guarantee them a second term. So, this has been obviously the game for a long, long time, and so Labour have to respond knowing that this is the strategy being thrown at them. So. Everyone is quite rightly accusing them of sort of dodging the realities just as the government is. But as far as I see, it's sort of working. Keir Starmer stood up and said, look, we've always believed in cutting taxes on working people, so you've done that, we're not going to oppose it. We've always believed in giving fuel duty, lower fuel duty to drivers, so we back that too. The moment everyone's waiting for is when they come in, how big their shocked face will be at the state of finances and whether they can pull off the political trick of saying, look, we have discovered a terrible black hole here. We need to reverse some measures or introduce different things or do something really, really difficult. Or maybe they're going to attempt to do what Gordon Brown did in the late 90s, which was stick to some really difficult spending totals for a couple of years, knowing they've still got everyone's goodwill, and then sort of turn on the taps when things ease up a bit. But I think they've done as well as they could in the sense that whatever this Tory strategy is meant to be, putting them on the spot, it hasn't quite worked. The £28 billion U-turn, there was a kind of a blip in the polls, and then it carried on as before. I mean, what do you think, Jill?
Well, I think it's really interesting. Are people paying huge amounts of attention to all of this? I mean, Budget Day is always quite interesting that it gets so much attention compared to other government policy announcements probably have much more effect on people's day-to-day lives. So Jeremy Hunt will obviously be hoping that people do notice changes in their pay packets from his NIC reduction and feel a bit better off. But as Keir Starmer was saying, this is still a pretty bleak outlook for living standards. This is the parliament when people are going to be poor at the end, tax burden at a 70-year high. And he was still throwing all of those at it. And basically, if the question at the time of the election is, do you feel better off? Do you feel you've got a government that actually understands what you're worried about? And things like that. I'm not sure that this budget will have changed anyone's view on whether they feel much, much better off after those years. What's really interesting, I think, is looking at the US election, that we all look very enviously over to the US, and President Biden seems to be suffering because, you hear vox pops in the US of people saying the economy is doing so
Although
badly.
It's much more partisan
I think we'd quite like a bit of that here. But anyway,
the economic perspectives they track partisan bias quite incredibly. But you pointed out earlier how often he mentioned public services improvements, and one of the risks that Jeremy Hunt has to say, we've got the plan working, isn't it great with inflation, isn't our growth good, aren't public services going well, isn't debt falling? And when this isn't people's felt experience, he takes a huge risk because people hate being gaslighted. They can't bear the thought that the people in the centre are saying everything's fine, look at my chart.
So if you're in Birmingham and you're about to see, every,
and
half your libraries close, and budgets cut, and a 21% council tax
he's saying we've got
hike,
public
you're not
services
feel,
back on track. And I think there's a real risk of sounding crass there within the Whitehall bubble. You want to win the argument with the annoying guy on Twitter who tells you your economy is doing badly and say, we're doing better than Germany. That guy in Birmingham doesn't really care whether we're doing better than Germany. He says, why is my council falling over?
Yeah. And I mean, Olly, on this point about how people are going to feel, the OBR forecasts were actually slightly better today, right, for household incomes over the next year. Talk us through that. Is that going to feel much different to people?
Sure. So, I mean, we have seen an improvement in the OBR forecast for household incomes. That's partly because of the tax changes introduced today, but also because of lower inflation. I don't think it's going to make a huge difference to how people feel necessarily, though. I mean, we're not quite going to the same depths as before, but there's still a fall in household incomes, and it takes a while to recover to pre-pandemic levels. So I think there's a slight improvement, but it's not looking great, and people are still going to feel worse off than they did, which I think is the really important thing in terms of thinking about how the economy is going to affect their voting intention.
Right, well, I think we're going to have to wrap things up now, but I want to end with a couple of asking you to predict the future questions in a very unfair manner. Olly, starting with you first, do you think on the basis of everything we've seen, we're likely to get tax rises after the next election, even if they're not talked about before?
Probably. What we're certainly going to get is a huge change in overall fiscal policy, because the current situation just doesn't add up. So that probably means a rise in taxes that isn't going to be talked about before the election. It could mean a reduction in spending, but based on our research on how public services are at their limit, that has to mean a reduction in the functions of the state, not just an efficiency drive.
When you say they add up, you mean that the current tax system is not going to generate the revenues for the kind of public services that both parties are talking about wanting?
Yeah, exactly. So it's not consistent with maintaining services as they are and providing all the increases that have been promised. We could have a change in fiscal policy as it relates to debt and borrowing, but as it stands, both parties seem pretty committed to at least stabilising the debt to GDP ratio, if not trying to get it full.
Giles, betting question for you. Yeah. You're a betting man.
I'm afraid I am, yes.
Olly seems to think it's likely that we might get another fiscal event before the election. God help us. Where's your money?
I think it's quite likely, and I say that with such sort of ash in my mouth. I can't believe it, but I do think that there are many voices in this government making different arguments. One of them is things are just going to get worse. We're going to sour in the electorate, and we've got to go soon because we're now about protecting the future existence of the Conservative Party. Those voices will be saying go for a May election because who knows how much trouble we're going to have from our own party in the summer. And I would be really grateful if those voices are heard. However, there's a kind of hold on and hope policy. And also, if the whole point is to put Labour under pressure and to make all the questions go at Labour, and how are you going to fund this, how are you going to fund that, then that's surely a strategy that has to be given time. It has to be something that you wind up the commentators and start really practicing it and shouting at them. What would be the point of shooting this Labour fox of the non-dom non-dom tax raising, which was going to fund so many good ideas, if not to have a decent go at really attacking Labour with it? So I'm really worried that they want to A, hang on for a long time, and then B, try to sort of really reiterate this tax-cutting agenda yet again. So I would say it's better than an even shot that they have a go at another fiscal moment, and my heart just sinks at the thought.
So Jill, maybe this is not the last time we'll see Jeremy Hunt stand up and announce some fiscal policy measures, but based on what you've seen so far, how do you think he's going to be remembered as a chancellor? He came in with a mission to stabilise things after Kwasi Kwarteng's mini-budget. Has he managed to maintain the grown-up-in-the-room image? How's he going to be remembered?
I think it was most at the risk today that he would actually sort of, go for broke. I think it may depend on whether he is backed into the corner of doing the sort of emergency fiscal event, the sort of surprise September statement that Giles and Olly have suggested might be in the wings to do that. But I think the big memory of Jeremy Hunt, I think, is that he wasn't Kwasi Kwarteng and he came in with Rishi Sunak to stabilise the market. So in that sense, he will be remembered as a sort of slightly boring but stabilising sort of chancellor, not a sort of, he's not yet going down in the annals as a dramatic Lawson-esque reformer, or a sort of big policy brain trying to interfere across government. I think he's probably a bit more in the Alistair Darling camp of sort of,
who we all remember very well.
So probably look all right, but I do think it's sort of, going to be quite interesting to see where the debate goes. And of course, there is still floating out there some people suggesting that perhaps Rishi Sunak would like to sub in an alternative chancellor before an election.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, that is it for us today. Thank you to Olly Bartrum, Jill Rutter and Giles Wilkes. Thank you all for listening to this episode, and thank you to everyone who's been watching at home. You can find all our podcasts, including our brilliant new 6-part series Preparing for Power, at Acast, Spotify, iTunes, and wherever you get your podcasts. Remember to subscribe and do leave us a review. We've got some exciting IFG events coming up, including our Centre Commission launch with John Major and Gordon Brown. You can find out more about all of that on our website, so please do sign up. Until then, we should have a good few days of wall-to-wall post-budget coverage. I'm sure you're champing at the bit for that, and have a good weekend, everyone.
Cheers.